The morning mist hung thick over Windsor Castle as Captain James Morrison adjusted his red ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be just another routine day of royal duties. At 52 years old, Morrison had served the crown for over 3 decades, witnessing the changing of monarchs and the evolution of royal traditions. His weathered hands, scarred from years of military service before joining the Royal Guard, trembled slightly as he fastened the gold buttons of his tunic. Something felt different about this day, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The captain had been summoned to an emergency briefing at dawn, an unusual occurrence that set his nerves on edge. As he walked through the ancient corridors of the castle, his polished boots echoing against the stone floors, he passed portraits of kings and queens who had ruled for centuries. Each face seemed to watch him with silent judgment, as if they knew what was coming before he did. In the briefing room, Morrison found himself face-to-face with Sir Edmund Hartwell, the Queen's private secretary, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who always looked as though he had just swallowed something unpleasant. Hartwell's usually pale complexion appeared even more ghostly than usual, and his hands shuffled through a stack of official documents with nervous energy. The news that Hartwell delivered hit Morrison like a physical blow. Queen Camilla, who had been crowned alongside King Charles III, was to receive a new ceremonial title that would elevate her status within the royal hierarchy. The title, Guardian of the Ancient Crown, was being created specifically for her, and it would come with responsibilities that had traditionally belonged to other members of the royal family for generations. Morrison listened in stunned silence as Hartwell explained the details. The new title would grant Queen Camilla authority over certain royal ceremonies and traditions that had been carefully preserved for hundreds of years. She would have the power to modify or even eliminate customs that had been sacred to the British people since before recorded history. The Queen would also gain control over the selection and training of new royal guards, a responsibility that had always rested with senior military officials. As Hartwell continued speaking, Morrison's mind raced back to his childhood, when his grandfather, also a royal guard, had told him stories about the sacred duty of protecting not just the monarch's physical safety, but also the traditions and values that the crown represented. His grandfather had served under Queen Elizabeth II during her early years on the throne, and he had instilled in young James a deep respect for the continuity and stability that the monarchy provided to the nation. The captain remembered his grandfather's words clearly. A royal guard doesn't just protect the person wearing the crown, James. We protect what the crown means to the people. We are the keepers of tradition, the guardians of history itself. Those words had guided Morrison throughout his entire career, through moments of doubt and difficulty, through changes in government and shifts in public opinion about the monarchy. Now, as he sat in the briefing room listening to plans that seemed to threaten the very foundations of those traditions, Morrison felt a growing sense of unease. He had served Queen Camilla faithfully since her coronation, treating her with the same respect and dedication he had shown to all members of the royal family. But this new title felt different, like an overreach that went beyond the natural evolution of royal customs. Hartwell seemed to sense Morrison's discomfort and attempted to reassure him. The private secretary explained that the new title was meant to honor Queen Camilla's contributions to the monarchy and to give her a more active role in preserving British heritage. He emphasized that the changes would be gradual and carefully considered, designed to modernize certain aspects of royal protocol while maintaining the dignity and respect that the crown deserved. But Morrison wasn't convinced. He had seen too many changes over the years, some necessary and beneficial, others that seemed to chip away at the very essence of what made the monarchy special. The Royal Guard had always prided itself on being above politics and personal preferences, serving whoever wore the crown with equal dedication. However, this felt like something more than a simple ceremonial adjustment. After the briefing ended, Morrison walked slowly back to his quarters, his mind churning with conflicting thoughts and emotions. He passed other guards in the hallways, men and women who had dedicated their lives to royal service just as he had. Some nodded respectfully. Others seemed lost in their own thoughts, perhaps having heard rumors about the upcoming announcement. In his private room, Morrison sat on his narrow military-style bed and stared at a framed photograph of himself with his grandfather. taken on the day he had first joined the Royal Guard. The old man's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, asking him what he intended to do with the sacred trust that had been passed down through generations of their family. The captain picked up his service manual, a thick book that outlined the duties and responsibilities of the Royal Guard. He had memorized every page years ago, but now he found himself searching for guidance, looking for some precedent that might help him understand how to handle this unprecedented situation. The manual spoke of loyalty, duty, honor, and service, but it also emphasized the Guard's role as protectors of royal tradition and constitutional monarchy. As the afternoon sun began to filter through his small window, Morrison realized that he was facing the most difficult decision of his career. He could accept the new arrangement quietly, continuing to serve as he always had, or he could take a stand for what he believed were the true values of the crown. Either choice would have consequences that could affect not only his own future but also the futures of the men and women under his command. The weight of tradition pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, and Morrison knew that whatever decision he made in the coming days would echo through the halls of the castle for years to come. The question that haunted him was simple yet profound. What would his grandfather have done? 3 days had passed since the briefing, and Captain Morrison found himself unable to concentrate on his usual duties. Every morning inspection felt hollow. Every ceremonial detail seemed meaningless when weighed against the magnitude of what was being proposed. He watched his fellow guards go about their routines, wondering if any of them shared his growing concerns about Queen Camilla's new title and the changes it would bring. The captain decided he needed to speak with someone who might understand his dilemma. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had served under his command for 8 years and had proven herself to be both intelligent and principled. More importantly, she came from a family with deep military traditions and understood the weight of duty and honor that guided their service. Morrison found Chen in the armory, meticulously cleaning her ceremonial sword, a task that required no supervision, but demonstrated the kind of attention to detail that made her an excellent guard. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes held the same intensity that had made her one of the youngest officers ever promoted to lieutenant in the Royal Guard. Without revealing the specific details of what he had learned in the briefing, Morrison began a careful conversation about duty, tradition, and the responsibilities of those who served the crown. He spoke about the delicate balance between respecting the monarchy and protecting the institutions that made it meaningful to the British people. Chen listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions that revealed her own deep understanding of their role. She had studied constitutional law before joining the military and brought a scholar's perspective to her service. As their conversation continued, Morrison realized that she shared many of his concerns about the direction in which royal protocols were heading. The lieutenant mentioned several changes she had observed over the past few years, small modifications to ceremonies and procedures that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively suggested a pattern of departure from established traditions. She spoke with quiet passion about the importance of maintaining continuity with the past, not out of blind resistance to change, but out of respect for the generations of people who had found meaning and stability in royal customs. Morrison felt a sense of relief at finding someone who understood his perspective, but he also recognized the burden he was placing on Chen by involving her in his doubts. He made it clear that whatever decisions lay ahead, she should not feel obligated to support any action he might take. Her career and future were her own responsibility, and he would not ask her to sacrifice her position for his principles. However, Chen surprised him with her response. She had been thinking about many of the same issues independently and had reached similar conclusions about their duty as guards. She believed that their oath to serve the crown included a responsibility to speak up when they saw actions that might harm the institution they had sworn to protect. Over the following days, Morrison found himself in quiet conversations with other senior members of the Royal Guard. He was careful not to reveal anything from the confidential briefing, but he explored their thoughts about duty, tradition, and the proper limits of royal authority. What he discovered both surprised and troubled him. Many of the guards, particularly those with longer service records, shared his concerns about the gradual erosion of traditional protocols. They spoke about feeling caught between their personal loyalty to individual members of the royal family and their broader responsibility to the institution of monarchy itself. Some had witnessed changes that they believed weakened the dignity and significance of royal ceremonies, while others worried about the political implications of certain royal actions. Sergeant William Davies, a gruff veteran with 25 years of service, pulled Morrison aside after one particularly revealing conversation. Davies had served in the Falklands War before joining the Royal Guard and brought a soldier's direct perspective to royal service. He spoke bluntly about his concerns regarding Queen Camilla's influence on royal protocols and her apparent desire to reshape traditions that had served the monarchy well for centuries. Davies revealed that he had heard rumors about the upcoming announcement of a new title for Queen Camilla, though he didn't know the specific details. He expressed worry that such changes might set a precedent for future modifications that could fundamentally alter the character of the monarchy. The sergeant's words carried weight because of his reputation for political neutrality and his unwavering dedication to duty. As Morrison gathered more information about the feelings of his fellow guards, he began to realize that his concerns were shared by a significant portion of the Royal Guard's senior leadership. These were not people prone to rebellion or dramatic gestures, but rather dedicated professionals who had devoted their lives to royal service and had earned the right to be heard when they spoke about matters affecting their duties. The captain also discovered that some guards had been quietly documenting changes to royal protocols over the past few years, creating an unofficial record of modifications that had been implemented without public announcement or consultation with traditional advisors. This documentation painted a picture of systematic alteration of established procedures, often in ways that concentrated more authority in the hands of individual royals rather than maintaining the collective wisdom of institutional practice. Morrison realized that the new title for Queen Camilla was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a broader pattern of change that threatened to transform the monarchy in ways that might not serve the long-term interests of either the crown or the British people. The weight of this realization forced him to confront a painful truth. Remaining silent might be the easier choice, but it would not be the honorable one. The captain spent a sleepless night walking the ancient corridors of Windsor Castle, passing through rooms where kings and queens had made decisions that shaped the destiny of nations. He thought about the courage required to speak truth to power and the personal cost that such courage often demanded. He also thought about the alternative cost of remaining silent and allowing changes to proceed that he believed would ultimately harm the institution he had sworn to protect. By dawn, Morrison had reached a decision that would change the course of his life and potentially the future of the Royal Guard itself. He would not accept Queen Camilla's new title quietly, but he would also not act alone or in haste. If he was going to take a stand, it would be done properly, with the support of his fellow guards and with careful consideration of the consequences for everyone involved. Captain Morrison knew that any action he took would need to be carefully planned and executed with the precision that had defined his military career. He could not simply voice his objections in an emotional outburst or through informal complaints that could be easily dismissed. If he was going to challenge Queen Camilla's new title, he needed to do it through proper channels and with the kind of documentation that would force the royal household to take his concerns seriously. The captain began by researching the historical precedents for royal titles and the procedures that had traditionally governed their creation and implementation. He spent hours in the castle's library, poring over centuries-old documents that outlined the delicate balance of power within the monarchy and the role that various advisors and officials had played in maintaining constitutional propriety. What Morrison discovered during his research both validated his concerns and provided him with the foundation he needed for formal objections. The title Guardian of the Ancient Crown was indeed unprecedented, and the powers it would grant to Queen Camilla had no historical basis in British royal tradition. More troubling still, the process by which the title was being created seemed to bypass several consultative mechanisms that had been established to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral change to royal protocol. Morrison learned that traditionally, significant changes to royal titles and responsibilities required consultation with the Privy Council, input from senior military officials, and review by constitutional scholars who specialized in royal law. None of these consultations appeared to have taken place, suggesting that Queen Camilla and her advisors were attempting to implement the changes through administrative decree rather than through established constitutional processes. Armed with this information, Morrison began drafting a formal memorandum that outlined his objections to the new title and the process by which it was being created. He was careful to frame his arguments in terms of constitutional propriety and institutional integrity, rather than personal opposition to Queen Camilla herself. The document focused on precedent, procedure, and the potential long-term consequences of allowing such changes to proceed without proper oversight. The memorandum took Morrison several days to complete, as he wanted to ensure that every argument was thoroughly researched and properly substantiated. He consulted legal texts, historical records, and constitutional documents to build a case that would be difficult to dismiss on procedural grounds. The captain also reached out to Lieutenant Chen and Sergeant Davies for their input on specific sections of the document, though he made it clear that their involvement was voluntary and would remain confidential. While Morrison worked on his formal objections, he also began building support among his fellow guards through careful and discreet conversations. He shared his research findings with senior officers who had expressed similar concerns, providing them with the historical context they needed to understand the significance of what was being proposed. The captain was careful not to pressure anyone to support his position, but he wanted to ensure that those who shared his concerns had access to accurate information about the constitutional implications of Queen Camilla's new title. The response from his fellow guards was both encouraging and sobering. Many of them expressed strong support for Morrison's position and offered to add their names to any formal protest he might submit. However, others warned him about the potential consequences of challenging the royal family directly, particularly when the objections concerned Queen Camilla, who had worked hard to establish her legitimacy within the monarchy. Sergeant Davies was particularly blunt in his assessment of the situation. He pointed out that Morrison's career would almost certainly be over if he proceeded with formal objections, regardless of the constitutional merits of his arguments. The royal household did not tolerate dissent from within its ranks, and history was filled with examples of officials who had been quietly removed from their positions after questioning royal decisions. Despite these warnings, Davies also made it clear that he supported Morrison's position and would stand with him if the captain decided to proceed. The sergeant's military experience had taught him that sometimes the right course of action required personal sacrifice, and he believed that the integrity of the Royal Guard was worth defending, even at the cost of individual careers. Lieutenant Chen approached the situation from a different angle, focusing on the legal and constitutional implications of remaining silent in the face of what appeared to be improper procedures. She argued that their oath to serve the crown included a responsibility to protect the institution from actions that might weaken its constitutional foundation, even when those actions came from within the royal family itself. Chen had conducted her own research into the proposed title and had reached conclusions similar to Morrison's about its unprecedented nature and the problematic process by which it was being implemented. She believed that failing to raise formal objections would set a dangerous precedent that could lead to further erosion of constitutional safeguards in the future. As word of Morrison's research and concerns spread quietly through the senior ranks of the Royal Guard, a clear division began to emerge. Roughly half of the senior officers supported the captain's position and were prepared to join him in formal objections to Queen Camilla's new title. The other half, while sympathetic to his concerns, believed that challenging the royal family directly would do more harm than good to the institution they were sworn to protect. This division created a tense atmosphere within the Royal Guard, as officers who had worked together harmoniously for years found themselves on opposite sides of a fundamental question about duty and loyalty. Some argued that their obligation was to serve without question, accepting whatever decisions the royal family made about titles and responsibilities. Others believed that true service to the crown required them to speak up when they saw actions that might harm the monarchy's long-term interests. Morrison found himself at the center of these debates, serving as both a catalyst for discussion and a target for criticism from those who disagreed with his approach. He tried to maintain the unity and discipline that had always characterized the Royal Guard, but he also recognized that the situation had already changed the dynamics. within their ranks in ways that could not be easily reversed. The captain realized that he had reached a point of no return in his decision-making process. His research was complete, his memorandum was nearly finished, and he had gathered as much support as he was likely to receive from his fellow guards. The time had come to decide whether to submit his formal objections and face the consequences, or to abandon his concerns and accept Queen Camilla's new title without protest. As he sat in his quarters on the eve of making his final decision, Morrison reflected on the oath he had taken when he first joined the Royal Guard decades earlier. The words echoed in his mind: to serve the crown with honor, to protect the monarchy with dedication, and to maintain the traditions that gave meaning to royal service. Tomorrow he would discover whether living up to that oath required submission or resistance. The morning of decision arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. Captain Morrison rose before dawn, as was his custom, but this time he dressed with particular care, knowing that this might be the last day he would wear the uniform that had defined his identity for over 3 decades. Every button, every insignia, every detail of his appearance was perfect, reflecting the pride and dignity he had always brought to his service. Morrison had completed his formal memorandum the night before, and it now sat on his desk in a sealed envelope addressed to Sir Edmund Hartwell, the Queen's private secretary. The document was comprehensive and carefully worded, presenting his objections to Queen Camilla's new title in language that was respectful but uncompromising. He had included extensive citations from constitutional law, historical precedent, and royal protocol to support each of his arguments. The memorandum began by acknowledging Morrison's deep respect for the monarchy and his unwavering commitment to royal service. It then systematically outlined the constitutional problems with creating the title Guardian of the Ancient Crown without proper consultation and oversight. The document detailed how the proposed powers associated with the title exceeded traditional boundaries and could potentially undermine the carefully balanced system of checks and balances that had evolved within the monarchy over centuries. Most importantly, Morrison's memorandum argued that accepting such changes without formal protest would set a dangerous precedent that could lead to further erosion of constitutional safeguards. He pointed out that the Royal Guard's oath included a responsibility to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the institutional integrity of the crown itself. Before submitting the memorandum, Morrison had one final meeting with the senior officers who had agreed to support his position. Lieutenant Chen, Sergeant Davies, and 6 other veteran guards gathered in a small conference room that had been used for military planning during both World Wars. The walls were lined with portraits of former guards who had served with distinction, their faces serving as silent witnesses to the gravity of the moment. Morrison read the complete memorandum aloud to the assembled officers, giving each of them a final opportunity to withdraw their support if they had second thoughts about the potential consequences. He emphasized that their careers would almost certainly be ended by their participation in this formal protest, and he wanted to ensure that everyone understood the personal cost of their principled stand. The response from his fellow officers was unanimous and immediate. Each of them confirmed their commitment to supporting the memorandum and added their signatures to the document without hesitation. Sergeant Davies spoke for the group when he said that their military training had taught them to distinguish between orders that deserved obedience and actions that required resistance, and this situation clearly fell into the latter category. Lieutenant Chen added that their legal research had convinced her that remaining silent would make them complicit in constitutional violations that could have long-term consequences for the monarchy. She argued that history would judge them harshly if they failed to speak up when they had the knowledge and opportunity to prevent institutional damage. With the support of his fellow officers confirmed, Morrison sealed the memorandum and prepared to deliver it personally to Sir Edmund Hartwell. The walk to the private secretary's office felt longer than usual, as Morrison passed through corridors filled with centuries of royal history. He thought about all the previous occasions when loyal servants of the crown had been forced to choose between personal safety and institutional integrity, and he drew strength from their examples of courage and principle. Hartwell received Morrison in his ornate office, surrounded by the formal trappings of royal administration. The private secretary's expression revealed that he suspected the nature of Morrison's visit, though he maintained the courteous demeanor that characterized all official interactions within the royal household. When Morrison presented the sealed memorandum, Hartwell accepted it with visible reluctance, as if touching the document might somehow contaminate him with its contents. The private secretary read the memorandum in complete silence, while Morrison stood at attention, waiting for a response. Hartwell's face grew increasingly pale as he progressed through the document, and by the time he finished reading, his hands were visibly trembling. The constitutional arguments presented in the memorandum were thorough and well-researched, making them difficult to dismiss on legal or procedural grounds. Hartwell's initial response was an attempt to characterize Morrison's objections as insubordination and breach of protocol. He reminded the captain that members of the Royal Guard were expected to serve without question, and that challenging royal decisions was incompatible with their oath of loyalty. The private secretary suggested that Morrison had misunderstood both his role and his responsibilities, and he offered the captain an opportunity to withdraw the memorandum and accept reassignment to less sensitive duties. Morrison politely but firmly declined Hartwell's offer, explaining that his oath to serve the crown included a responsibility to protect the constitutional foundations of the monarchy, even when that protection required difficult decisions. He pointed out that the memorandum was carefully researched and respectfully worded, representing legitimate constitutional concerns rather than personal insubordination. The captain also informed Hartwell that several other senior officers shared his concerns and had signed the memorandum in support of his position. This news clearly surprised and alarmed the private secretary, who had apparently assumed that Morrison was acting alone in his objections to Queen Camilla's new title. Hartwell attempted to minimize the significance of the constitutional arguments presented in the memorandum, suggesting that royal prerogative allowed for flexibility in matters of titles and ceremonies. However, Morrison's research had anticipated this response, and the memorandum included specific citations showing that royal prerogative had traditional limits and could not be used to bypass established constitutional processes without legitimate justification. The meeting concluded with Hartwell promising to review Morrison's concerns and provide a formal response within 48 hours. However, the private secretary's demeanor made it clear that he viewed the memorandum as a serious threat to the royal household's plans and that he would be recommending immediate disciplinary action against Morrison and his supporters. As Morrison left Hartwell's office, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had finally taken the action that his conscience and his understanding of duty had demanded, but he also knew that the consequences would be swift and severe. The royal household did not tolerate challenges to its authority, regardless of the constitutional merits of those challenges. The captain returned to his quarters and began the process of preparing for his inevitable dismissal from royal service. He carefully packed his personal belongings and organized his official files, ensuring that his replacement would be able to assume his duties without disruption. Morrison had served the crown faithfully for over 3 decades, and he intended to maintain his professionalism even in the face of what he knew would be harsh retaliation for his principled stand. That evening, Morrison received word that Queen Camilla herself had been informed about his memorandum and was demanding an immediate meeting with him. The summons came with implicit threats about the consequences of his actions and warnings about the damage his objections might cause to the royal family's reputation. As he prepared for what would likely be his final official meeting as a member of the Royal Guard, Morrison reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He felt no regret about his decision to speak up for constitutional propriety, but he also understood that the personal cost of his principles would be higher than he had initially anticipated. The Queen's private drawing room at Windsor Castle had witnessed countless moments of royal history, from intimate family gatherings to crucial state decisions that shaped the destiny of nations. Now, as Captain Morrison stood at attention before Queen Camilla, the ornate chamber felt charged with tension that seemed to make the very air thick and difficult to breathe. The Queen sat behind an antique mahogany desk, her expression revealing a mixture of anger, disappointment, and barely controlled fury. Queen Camilla had clearly been briefed extensively about Morrison's memorandum, and her opening words left no doubt about her feelings regarding his formal objections to her new title. She spoke in measured tones that somehow made her displeasure more intimidating than any shouting could have been. The Queen accused Morrison of overstepping his authority, betraying the trust that had been placed in him, and undermining the dignity of the royal family through his constitutional challenges. Morrison listened respectfully to Queen Camilla's criticisms while maintaining his military bearing, but he did not back down from the position he had taken in his memorandum. When given the opportunity to respond, he carefully explained that his objections were based on constitutional law and historical precedent, rather than personal opposition to Her Majesty or any member of the royal family. The captain emphasized that his oath to serve the crown included a responsibility to protect the institutional integrity of the monarchy, even when that protection required difficult decisions. Queen Camilla's response revealed the depth of her anger and her determination to proceed with her plans despite Morrison's objections. She informed the captain that his concerns about constitutional propriety were misguided and that the royal family had both the authority and the responsibility to adapt royal protocols to meet the needs of modern times. The Queen argued that Morrison's rigid adherence to historical precedent would prevent the monarchy from evolving and remaining relevant to contemporary British society. The exchange between Queen Camilla and Morrison became increasingly heated as each maintained their position with unwavering conviction. The Queen accused the captain of using constitutional arguments to mask personal prejudices and suggested that his objections were motivated by resistance to her role within the royal family rather than genuine concern for institutional integrity. She pointed out that she had worked tirelessly to earn her place within the monarchy, and that Morrison's challenges undermined her efforts to contribute meaningfully to royal service. Morrison firmly rejected these accusations, explaining that his objections would be identical regardless of which member of the royal family was seeking to assume unprecedented powers through improper procedures. He provided specific examples from his memorandum, showing how the proposed title and its associated responsibilities violated constitutional principles that had been carefully developed over centuries to maintain the balance of power within the monarchy. The captain also revealed that his research had uncovered other recent changes to royal protocol that had been implemented without proper consultation or oversight, suggesting a pattern of constitutional violations that extended beyond the immediate issue of Queen Camilla's new title. This information clearly surprised and alarmed the Queen, who had apparently been unaware of the broader implications of the precedent she was attempting to establish. Queen Camilla attempted to end the confrontation by offering Morrison a compromise that would allow both sides to save face while proceeding with her plans. She suggested that the title could be modified to address some of his constitutional concerns, while still granting her the enhanced role within the monarchy that she sought. The Queen emphasized that this compromise would allow Morrison to maintain his position within the royal guard, while demonstrating appropriate respect for royal authority. However, Morrison politely but firmly declined the offered compromise, explaining that the fundamental constitutional problems with the proposed title could not be resolved through minor modifications. He argued that any title created through improper procedures would set a dangerous precedent, regardless of its specific powers or responsibilities. The captain also pointed out that accepting a compromise would effectively validate the constitutional violations that had already occurred in the process of developing the proposal. The Queen's patience finally reached its breaking point, and she delivered an ultimatum that left no room for further negotiation. Morrison could withdraw his memorandum, accept the compromise she had offered, and continue his service as if the confrontation had never occurred. Or he could maintain his position and face immediate dismissal from the royal guard along with all the officers who had supported his constitutional objections. Morrison requested a brief moment to consider his options, though he already knew what his decision would be. He thought about his decades of faithful service, his deep love for the institution of monarchy, and his responsibility to the principles that had guided his entire career. The captain also considered the fate of the officers who had trusted him enough to add their signatures to his memorandum and who would share the consequences of whatever decision he made. When Morrison announced his final decision, his voice was steady, and his military bearing remained perfect despite the emotional weight of the moment. He informed Queen Camilla that he could not in good conscience withdraw his constitutional objections, or accept a compromise that would validate improper procedures. The captain explained that his oath to serve the crown required him to protect the institutional integrity of the monarchy, even at the cost of his own career and the careers of his supporters. Queen Camilla's reaction to Morrison's decision was swift and decisive. She immediately terminated his appointment as captain of the Royal Guard and ordered his removal from royal service within 24 hours. The Queen also demanded the names of all officers who had supported his memorandum, making it clear that they would face similar consequences for their participation in what she characterized as an act of insubordination and betrayal. Morrison provided the requested names without hesitation, refusing to abandon the officers who had courageously supported his position, despite knowing the personal cost of their principles. He explained that each of these officers had carefully considered their decision and had acted according to their understanding of duty and constitutional responsibility. The meeting concluded with Queen Camilla expressing her profound disappointment in Morrison's actions and her determination to ensure that such challenges to royal authority would not be tolerated in the future. She informed him that his service record would reflect his dismissal for insubordination, and that he would receive no recommendations or assistance in finding future employment. As Morrison left the Queen's presence for the final time, he felt a complex mixture of emotions ranging from sadness at the end of his career to pride in having stood up for his principles when it mattered most. He had served the crown faithfully for over 3 decades, and while his service was ending in controversy and dismissal, he believed that his final act as captain of the Royal Guard had been his most important contribution to the institution he loved. The walk back to his quarters felt like a journey through his entire career, as Morrison passed through corridors and chambers where he had served with distinction during some of the most significant moments in recent royal history. Tomorrow, he would be a civilian for the first time in over 30 years. But he would also be a man who had honored his oath to protect the crown, even when that protection required challenging those who wore it. News of Captain Morrison's dismissal and the constitutional controversy surrounding Queen Camilla's new title spread through Windsor Castle like wildfire, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that affected everyone from senior officials to junior staff members. The 8 royal guards who had supported Morrison's memorandum were summoned individually to disciplinary hearings where they faced intense pressure to renounce their constitutional objections and distance themselves from their former captain's actions. Lieutenant Chen was the first to face questioning, and her experience set the tone for what the other officers could expect. She was brought before a panel consisting of Sir Edmund Hartwell, the Queen's private secretary, Lord Pemberton, the Lord Chamberlain, and General Sir Marcus Wellington, the senior military advisor to the royal household. The 3 men sat behind an imposing oak table in a formal hearing room, their expressions revealing their determination to make an example of the officers who had dared to challenge royal authority. The questioning began with attempts to characterize Chen's support for Morrison's memorandum as a momentary lapse in judgment that could be forgiven if she expressed appropriate remorse and committed to avoiding similar actions in the future. Lord Pemberton suggested that her youth and inexperience had made her susceptible to Morrison's influence, and he offered her the opportunity to save her career by accepting a transfer to less sensitive duties. However, Chen surprised the panel by maintaining her support for the constitutional arguments presented in Morrison's memorandum. She calmly explained that her decision to sign the document had been based on careful research and thoughtful consideration of her oath to serve the crown. The lieutenant argued that true loyalty to the monarchy required protecting its constitutional foundations, even when that protection conflicted with the immediate desires of individual royal family members. Chen's articulate defense of her position clearly frustrated the panel members, who had expected her to crumble under pressure and provide them with ammunition to use against Morrison and the other supporting officers. Instead, she presented additional constitutional arguments that she had developed since signing the memorandum, demonstrating that her commitment to the principles involved had only strengthened over time. The hearing became increasingly confrontational as the panel members attempted to break down Chen's resolve through intimidation and threats about her future prospects. General Wellington, in particular, accused her of betraying her military training and dishonoring the traditions of royal service. He suggested that her actions had damaged the reputation of the royal guard and undermined the trust that the royal family needed to have in their protection officers. Chen's response was both respectful and defiant. She pointed out that her military training had taught her to distinguish between lawful orders that deserved obedience and unlawful commands that required resistance. The lieutenant argued that her oath to serve the crown included a responsibility to protect the constitutional principles that gave the monarchy its legitimacy and authority. The other 7 officers who faced similar hearings maintained equally strong positions, despite facing intense pressure to abandon their support for Morrison's constitutional objections. Sergeant Davies proved particularly frustrating to the disciplinary panel, as his extensive military experience and deep knowledge of royal protocol made it difficult to characterize his actions as ignorant or misguided. Davies used his hearing as an opportunity to present additional evidence of constitutional violations that had occurred during the development of Queen Camilla's new title. He had conducted his own research following Morrison's dismissal and had discovered procedural irregularities that went beyond what had been documented in the original memorandum. The sergeant's findings suggested that the royal household had deliberately avoided constitutional safeguards in order to expedite the creation of the unprecedented title. The disciplinary hearings lasted for 3 days, during which time the atmosphere at Windsor Castle became increasingly strained. Word of the constitutional controversy began to leak beyond the castle walls, attracting attention from constitutional scholars, parliamentary officials, and media organizations that specialized in royal affairs. The royal household found itself facing external pressure to address the concerns raised by Morrison and his supporters, rather than simply dismissing them as insubordination. Professor Elizabeth Hartley, a renowned constitutional law expert from Oxford University, publicly supported the arguments presented in Morrison's memorandum after obtaining a copy through sources within the parliamentary system. Her analysis confirmed that the proposed title for Queen Camilla lacked historical precedent and violated established procedures for creating new royal responsibilities. Professor Hartley's intervention lent academic credibility to the constitutional objections and made it more difficult for the royal household to characterize them as the complaints of disgruntled employees. The intervention of external constitutional experts created a dilemma for the royal household, which had hoped to resolve the controversy quickly and quietly through disciplinary action against the challenging officers. Instead, the situation was becoming a public constitutional crisis that threatened to damage Queen Camilla's reputation and call into question the royal family's commitment to constitutional propriety. Sir Edmund Hartwell attempted to manage the growing crisis by reaching out to constitutional scholars who might be willing to defend the royal household's position. However, his efforts largely failed, as most experts who reviewed the situation agreed that the proposed title raised legitimate constitutional concerns that deserved serious consideration rather than summary dismissal. The media attention surrounding the controversy also put pressure on parliamentary officials to investigate the constitutional implications of Queen Camilla's new title. Several members of the House of Commons submitted formal questions about the proper procedures for creating royal titles and the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to prevent constitutional violations. Meanwhile, the 8 dismissed royal guards found themselves in an unusual position as unemployed military officers whose principled stand had attracted significant public and academic support. Morrison received inquiries from constitutional organizations, military veterans groups, and academic institutions that were interested in his perspectives on royal service and constitutional responsibility. The former captain was particularly moved by messages of support from retired members of the Royal Guard who had served under previous monarchs. Many of these veterans expressed appreciation for Morrison's willingness to speak up for constitutional principles, even at the cost of his career. Several former guards revealed that they had witnessed similar constitutional violations during their own service but had lacked the courage or opportunity to challenge them. Effectively, the controversy also attracted international attention, as constitutional monarchies in other countries watched to see how Britain would resolve the conflict between royal prerogative and constitutional limitations. The situation had implications beyond the immediate issue of Queen Camilla's title, as it raised fundamental questions about the balance of power within modern constitutional monarchies. As the crisis continued to develop, it became clear that the royal household's attempt to silence constitutional objections through disciplinary action had backfired spectacularly. Instead of resolving the controversy quietly, the dismissal of Morrison and his supporters had transformed a private disagreement into a public constitutional crisis that threatened to have lasting implications for the monarchy's relationship with constitutional law and parliamentary oversight. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of Queen Camilla's controversial new title, but also the future of constitutional safeguards within the British monarchy. The constitutional crisis that had begun with Captain Morrison's memorandum reached its climax 3 weeks after his dismissal, when Parliament announced that it would be conducting a formal inquiry into the procedures used to create Queen Camilla's new title. The announcement sent shockwaves through the royal household, which had desperately hoped to contain the controversy within the confines of Windsor Castle and avoid external scrutiny of royal decision-making processes. The Parliamentary Constitutional Committee, led by Sir James Whitfield, a respected former judge with extensive experience in constitutional law, began its investigation by requesting all documents related to the development of the Guardian of the Ancient Crown title. The royal household's initial response was to claim executive privilege and resist providing the requested materials, arguing that internal royal deliberations were protected from parliamentary oversight. However, this resistance only intensified public and political pressure for transparency. Constitutional scholars, media organizations, and opposition political parties argued that the royal family's refusal to cooperate with the parliamentary inquiry suggested that they had something to hide regarding their constitutional violations. The controversy began to attract international attention, with constitutional experts from other monarchies expressing concern about the precedent that might be established if royal prerogative were allowed to override established constitutional processes. Morrison, meanwhile, had used his forced retirement to write a detailed account of his experiences and the constitutional concerns that had led to his dismissal. His book, titled Duty and Constitution, A Royal Guard's Oath, became an unexpected bestseller and provided the public with unprecedented insight into the inner workings of royal protocol and the constitutional foundations of the monarchy. The book's publication created another wave of controversy, as Morrison's detailed documentation of constitutional violations extended far beyond the immediate issue of Queen Camilla's title. He revealed a pattern of procedural shortcuts and unauthorized changes to royal protocol that had been occurring for several years, suggesting that the Queen's controversial title was merely the most visible example of a broader problem within the royal household. Morrison's revelations prompted several constitutional law professors to call for a comprehensive review of royal procedures and the establishment of stronger oversight mechanisms to prevent future violations. Professor Elizabeth Hartley organized a conference of constitutional experts who unanimously supported Morrison's arguments and called for the immediate suspension of Queen Camilla's new title. Pending a thorough constitutional review, the growing public pressure finally forced the royal household to reconsider its position. King Charles III, who had initially supported his wife's new title, began to express private concerns about the constitutional implications of the controversy and the damage it was causing to the monarchy's reputation. Palace insiders reported that the king was frustrated with his advisors for allowing the situation to escalate into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Queen Camilla, however, remained determined to proceed with her plans and refused to consider withdrawing the controversial title. She argued that surrendering to pressure from dismissed employees and academic critics would set a dangerous precedent that could undermine royal authority in the future. The Queen maintained that the monarchy had both the right and the responsibility to adapt its procedures to meet modern needs, even if those adaptations required departing from historical precedent. The disagreement between King Charles and Queen Camilla about how to handle the crisis created unprecedented tension within the royal family and led to rumors about serious marital difficulties. Palace staff reported heated arguments between the royal couple about the constitutional controversy and its implications for their reigns. The king's advisors were reportedly urging him to distance himself from his wife's position in order to protect his own constitutional standing. The parliamentary inquiry, meanwhile, had obtained key documents through court orders that overruled the royal household's claims of executive privilege. The documents revealed that senior advisors had warned Queen Camilla about the constitutional problems with her proposed title, but had been overruled by her determination to proceed with the plans. The inquiry also uncovered evidence that constitutional experts within the royal household had been deliberately excluded from the planning process to avoid receiving formal objections that might complicate the title's implementation. Sir James Whitfield's committee published its preliminary findings after 6 weeks of investigation, and the report was devastating for Queen Camilla and her supporters. The committee concluded that the creation of the Guardian of the Ancient Crown title had violated multiple constitutional principles and established precedents. The report also found that the royal household had deliberately circumvented established oversight mechanisms and had ignored legitimate constitutional concerns raised by their own advisors. Most significantly, the parliamentary report vindicated Morrison's constitutional arguments and criticized the royal household for dismissing legitimate concerns through disciplinary action rather than addressing them through proper constitutional channels. The committee recommended that Queen Camilla's title be immediately suspended and that comprehensive reforms be implemented to prevent similar constitutional violations in the future. The publication of the parliamentary report created an impossible situation for the royal family. They could not ignore the committee's findings without appearing to place themselves above constitutional law, but accepting the recommendations would require Queen Camilla to abandon the title she had fought so hard to obtain. The controversy had also attracted so much public attention that any resolution would be closely scrutinized by constitutional experts and political opponents. After extensive private negotiations between the royal family and parliamentary leaders, King Charles III announced that Queen Camilla would be withdrawing her acceptance of the Guardian of the Ancient Crown title pending a comprehensive review of royal procedures by an independent constitutional commission. The announcement was carefully worded to avoid admitting that constitutional violations had occurred, but it effectively represented a complete victory for Morrison's constitutional arguments. Queen Camilla's public statement about withdrawing the title was brief and clearly written through gritted teeth. She claimed that she was setting aside her personal preferences in order to allow for a thorough review of constitutional procedures that would benefit the monarchy in the long term. However, palace insiders reported that she was furious about being forced to abandon her plans and blamed Morrison and his supporters for undermining her efforts to contribute meaningfully to royal service. The constitutional commission that was established to review royal procedures ultimately recommended significant reforms to prevent future violations and restore public confidence in the monarchy's commitment to constitutional propriety. These reforms included mandatory consultation with constitutional experts before creating new royal titles, parliamentary oversight of significant changes to royal protocol, and protection for royal employees who raised legitimate constitutional concerns. Morrison was invited to testify before the Constitutional Commission, where he was praised for his courage in speaking up for constitutional principles, despite knowing the personal cost of his actions. The Commission's final report included a specific recommendation that Morrison and his supporting officers be offered reinstatement to their positions within the Royal Guard, with full recognition of their service and protection from retaliation. However, Morrison declined the offer of reinstatement, explaining that his relationship with Queen Camilla had been irreparably damaged by the constitutional controversy. Instead, he accepted a position as a constitutional advisor to the commission that had been established to oversee future royal procedures, allowing him to continue serving the crown in a different capacity while ensuring that the constitutional principles he had defended would be protected in the future. The controversy over Queen Camilla's title ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the constitutional foundations of the British monarchy. Morrison's willingness to challenge royal authority when it exceeded proper constitutional boundaries had forced a long overdue review of royal procedures and had established important precedents for protecting constitutional principles from future violations. The former Royal Guard captain had achieved something that seemed impossible when he first drafted his memorandum. He had successfully defended the crown against those who wore it, ensuring that the monarchy would continue to serve the British people within proper constitutional limits.